Welcome back. I'm Austin Westfall, a live look at the White House on this Saturday evening, 7:15 in the nation's capital. Politico says that senior Trump administration officials are heading to Saudi Arabia to start peace talks with Russian and Ukrainian negotiators, that's according to a Republican lawmaker and two U.S. officials familiar with the plan, again, speaking to Politico. But there was something that Politico added to this. They say a Ukrainian official later told them that the announcement of these Saudi talks are coming as a surprise to Kyiv. And as of now, there are no plans to send a Ukrainian delegation to that meeting. Host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer, is here. Hal, how could this come together without Ukraine getting a heads up?
Austin, it's really amazing how fast this has happened. I mean, this was just this last week. There was discussion of possibly a summit with Putin and Trump in Saudi Arabia. Now, all of a sudden, literally, we're talking about a U.S. delegation heading off to Saudi Arabia to meet with a Russian delegation. The U.S. is saying that the Ukrainians are going to be there, and of course, the Ukrainians have come back and said, "We don't know anything about this. We haven't been invited. We're not sure what it is." And meanwhile, you got President Zelensky very vocal about his concern that the U.S. and Russia basically reaching some sort of agreement on Ukraine, but not including Ukraine. And all of this in the backdrop of whatever's being discussed. The U.S. has said that that we may broker a deal between Ukraine and Russia, but the Europeans won't be a part of it. I have to tell you, it's been a pretty fast-moving week. It's been, a bit of a challenge just to keep up on all the new statements and change in policy, change in positions going on. This is interesting, though. This will be the first time, though, that we've seen anything like this since really the Ukraine war began almost 3 years ago. And so, whatever it is, and of course, I would also mention that the U.S. does not have to have Ukraine or any other countries involved in a dialogue with the Russians. We can talk to the Russians about a variety of things directly, and we talk to other countries directly all the time. But in so much as this is with the backdrop of talking about the Russo-Ukraine war, it would seem important that the Ukrainians are going to be there. And I think at this point, I would not be surprised if there's some rapid behind the scenes discussion, which is to make sure that the Ukrainians will have somebody there representing their interests, because it will look very strange. In fact, it will put tremendous strain on the U.S. if we're talking to the Russians in Saudi Arabia about the fate of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not there. That is really going to cause us issues in a variety of places around the world.
So that also, and you just touched on this, I want to expand on it, though. We also were reading today that major representatives from European powers are not going to be joining these talks either. How do you think that's sitting with some of the top figures in Europe, Hal?
I would say if I was in Berlin, Paris, or London, it would not be sitting very well at all. In fact, I would be very perturbed by seeing something like that. They all feel that they should be there at the table. At the very least, they probably feel there should be a European Union or a NATO rep at the table. And I think Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, would be a very good person to have at the table. But then again, I'm going to defer a little bit to General Kellogg, who is the special envoy working this. He's probably looking at the dynamic, and they may be looking at this saying, hey, we're trying to get the Russians just to the table to talk. That has been a challenge. Let's not throw too many players in right up front. Let's get a dialogue going, and then maybe if things are going well and we get a pattern, pattern going of ongoing discussions. And by the way, I would point out that this is not a quick, these sorts of discussions are rarely one and done, so to speak. They tend to go on for a very long time. The discussions we had with Afghanistan, with the Taliban, which, believe me, that's going to come up at some point, where we excluded the Afghan national government from the discussion on the fate of Afghanistan. That's echoing with what's going on or what's being discussed in this situation. But those sorts of discussions always go on for a very long time. The discussions on North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, went on for years, and there was a variety of things where they would hit high points and low points, and sometimes at the low points we would accentuate our position by launching massive B-52 strikes against North Vietnam just to make a point. So this can have a whole dynamic in and of itself. So we'll see where this all leads right now. But right now, there seems to be a strategic communications coordination problem coming out of the White House, and we've seen that all week with Secretary of Defense Hegseth saying something, and then J.D. Vance saying something, and then Secretary Hegseth literally turning around the next day and walking back what he'd said the day before. And there just does seem to be, it just seems a little coordinated in terms of messaging.
So this is all happening in the context of the Munich Security Conference taking place in Germany right now. Earlier, we heard from Zelensky himself. He spoke in front of a packed conference, and we saw a standing ovation for the president there. Zelensky speaking on the world stage today, Hal. I know you watched him speak. What seems to be the chief message that he was trying to broadcast to the world today?
I think there, if I really want to boil it down to two things. Number one is he said, look, the U.S. may not be there. You know, you can't build everything backstopped on the idea that the U.S. is going to step in and save the day. All right. And I think he made that very clear. In fact, he went so far as to indicate that the U.S., you know, if something, a security situation is happening in Europe, you can't be sure that the U.S. will even show up like it traditionally has. The other thing he really pushed forward was the idea of a European army, which is kind of a new idea, but it's built on an old idea. This idea, you know, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which you would say, well, that's kind of a European army. It is. It's most of it, by preponderance of forces, is Europe or European. However, it is North Atlantic. You know, the U.S. and Canada are both parts of it. The U.S. being kind of the arsenal democracy, if you will, with our tremendous ability. But the U.S. being different. The U.S. has an Atlantic European side, but it also has broader responsibilities looking at the Far East, looking at the West Pacific, looking at the Indian Ocean, you know, South Asia, you know, Africa, the Middle East. And certainly we've been busy in all these places over the last decade to 2 decades. So, you know, that's one of the things that Secretary Hegseth came in and said early on is he says, hey, look, we can't make Europe our top priority. We've got to look at this other thing, which is China, which is our near peer competitor out there in the world. He's talking about a European army. And this was something that originally was floated by the French back in the 50s, didn't go anywhere because NATO kind of superseded it. It kind of floated around a little bit in the 90s after the end of the Cold War, but it really started getting a lot of traction, if you will, about a decade ago. In fact, President Macron of France had talked in 2017 about a European army, and this is the idea that the Europe, meaning probably the European Union, would have its own standing force army that would pursue European interests. Now, when this first came out, the U.S. was a little uncomfortable with it. It's like, what are you guys trying to do? You know, basically, what's your plan here? You know, why aren't we a part of this? Because this would be something that Europe could pursue its own military policies, its own military stuff, completely separate. The fear at that time was, is this going to cause the, you know, the dissolvement or a dissolution of the NATO construct? You know, what's going to happen here? But he was bringing that up, and I think the reason he was bringing it up is because the U.S. has said, "Hey, look, NATO or Europe, you got to kind of take care of your own." And so he was bringing that up. He didn't mince words. He came right out and said they need to have a European army, and there have been attempts on that. If you look at, there was actually a joint battalion. I believe it was a French and German, or I believe it was a French and German battalion that they tried to put together. So there's been attempts to do smaller things, but nothing on the scale that he was talking about. This could really rewrite the geostrategic map regards Europe, and actually regards Eurasia, and potentially regards what happens in the Middle East and even down in Africa.
So there's one more thing. I didn't get to ask you about this yesterday, but it's been making the rounds. I I saw that what's being called an alleged drone at this point struck the protective shell covering the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. This happened early on Friday, and Ukrainian President Zelensky is pointing the finger at Russia. For those not familiar with the site, it protects the remains of the nuclear reactor that exploded in Chernobyl in 1986. Zelensky said initial assessments are showing that the damage to the shelter is significant. My question for you, Hal, is why Chernobyl? If I recall correctly, Russia took over the plant briefly in 2022. Why might they have targeted it again?
You know, I got to tell you, Russia does. I'm trying to think of the military term. Really dumb things sometimes,
That's a
and
military term.
this would definitely fall into that category. This may be a thought that they could cause they use as a sort of a radioactive, dispersion device, hit the shell, cause radioactivity to leak out there, cause the Ukrainians to have to abandon the area or something like that. As you can see, there's people up on the shell on the dome itself working up there, and I'm sure they're taking suitable precautions to make sure that they're not exposed to radiation or minimizing their exposure to radiation. And I'm sure they're going to fix that thing pretty darn quick. But that's a possibility. Of course, the other possibility too that you can't discount is that the Russians were sending the drone somewhere else, and it happened to hit there. Although that is such an isolated area, the idea that a drone would just by happenstance hit that dome seems pretty remote, statistically speaking. So it does look like the Russians did it, and it looks like the Russians are trying to send a message to, which has come up many times because there's multiple nuclear reactor sites, nuclear sites all over Ukraine, which is here's a vulnerability that we could exploit. And you may recall in Zaporizhia, there's been a lot over the last few years about the vulnerability of that nuclear complex, and that the Russians were engaged in military operations to exclude and to include ordnance landing in and around the nuclear facilities that was causing great fear. In fact, the fear was that could turn into an incident bigger than Chernobyl, which was an absolute horrific event when it occurred, when they had that explosion and meltdown at the Chernobyl plant back in the 80s. And by the way, that was so poorly managed. The cover up by the Soviet Union and just how badly they did it is always considered one of the main pillars of why the Soviet Union eventually fell apart a few years later. Was people lost confidence in the Soviet government. They just didn't trust them anymore, and they didn't think they could take care of them, wouldn't keep them safe.
Yeah. Hal Kempfer is the host of the Strat podcast. You recorded a new episode today, correct?
I did record a new episode and talked a lot about Russia, talked a lot about Europe, and kind of delved into something that we had touched on, which is dealing with the frozen Russian assets and talking about rare earths in Ukraine, and kind of getting into how this could be something that could basically support Ukraine in its war, the vulnerability that Russia's at strategically, militarily, specifically, and how this could be used to pressure Russia into getting, quote, a better deal out of whatever talks come out of it. So yes, it's out there, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it's on Apple, Spotify, Captivate, and most other platforms, and you can get it on YouTube. So just thought I'd casually mention that.
Casually, yes. Retired Marine Intelligence Officer Hal Kempfer. Good to see you. Talk soon.
All right. Thanks, Austin.